Right, am I live? Cool. Hey everyone, thank you for coming. I'm just saying I'm happy there's not just one person here. So that's always good to talk to a little bit more people. I'm going to do a quick introduction about myself, but first I think the video guy, I remember reading the GDC thing, it says don't wear reds and don't wear shiny things. So whoops. So I'll give a quick introduction. My name is Feng Zhu, and again, thank you guys for coming by to listen to the talk. I hope I make it very informative. My own background, I've been doing this for way too long, I think, close to 20 years now, in mostly video game design as well as film. I've been based in Los Angeles for a very long time. Started out way back with in the 96 with Wing Commander and so forth, or Origin and these companies. And then worked my way through a variety of things, eventually got myself into the movie side of things. One of the most fun I had was working on Star Wars, not the current one, the previous one, the Revenge of the Sith. And afterwards, in 2006, I actually went to China to start a game studio, because I was kind of hitting a career peak in terms of what I want to do personally, because when you start working on Star Wars and Transformers and so forth, it's a little hard to get out of that. That's kind of the height it goes in terms of Hollywood films. So I actually became an entrepreneur. In 2010, I went down to Singapore to try to do another game company. The previous one we had, we actually sold it, which was lucky. But in Singapore, I noticed that the talent in terms of international design was a little bit lacking. I thought maybe we could fill those shoes in. So I started a design school, and it's been running for the past 7 years. We've trained a lot of students. But as of last year, in about September-ish, I started another company, which I haven't publicly talked about. For those who came to my talk last year, I wrote this thing about don't overpromise, right? Just under-promise, over-deliver. So I do the same thing myself. I don't like to announce stuff on the internet. But I did start a film production studio, this time back to China again, this in Beijing, to help them produce IPs. China, some of you guys probably already know, is going to come up huge in terms of film production and games as well. So we're up there taking their IPs they're building and making them really good. And that's what this talk is about as well, because by doing through this process for the last 6 months or so, you're starting to learn about the mistakes the companies make, and a lot of money gets wasted in the early stages of IP creation. So I thought, hey, this would be a perfect time to maybe talk about that. But I'll do a quick video. I pressed the button, bam. Okay, so this introduces to the school real quick. So 2-minute video, and we'll get into the slides so we don't waste your time looking at things like this. All right, here we go. So this is my school in Singapore. Marketing. That's enough of that. Okay, let's actually get on to the real thing here. Oops, full screen. Turn this on. So for the last 7 years, we've been teaching students, and what we do with them really is similar to what we do at companies now, which is teaching them how to think in terms of design. And students sometimes even do a better job because that's the only thing they're doing. When we started working with other companies in terms of IP building, sometimes you get lost and the fundamentals are lost as well. You focus too much on things that doesn't matter and money starts to bleed, your burn rate starts going up. Maybe some of you guys can relate as we go through this. So what I'm going to talk about is very basic stuff. Some of you guys might already hear these. It might be even common sense. But really, sometimes it really helps to know this kind of things, because as right now I'm working with some of the students in China, and they'll go for 6 months burning money. And the IP just going all over the place, like woo, and then they end up basically going right back to square one with a $500,000 or $1 million loss in the process. So what we try to do right now is go in and clean up everything, including the scripts, the design, all from the starting point, and that's what this talk will be covering. So some points of without design thinking, some of the stuff I've noticed that studios run into, maybe some of you guys can relate as well, which is, number one, you waste a lot of time trying to find the design direction, right? Like you get the concept guys, you're like, okay, you try this, you try that. Meanwhile, they're all earning salaries. Now, as an artist yourself, maybe you don't care, you're just having fun. But your studio managers, they're writing those paychecks, and they're going, oh man, we're not getting anything. And it's week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, now you're $50,000 in the hole. So that's a common problem. Number 2 will be, you get great design sometimes, but no coherency. So one concept guy's drawing badass stuff, the other guy's drawing really cool stuff, but you put them together, they're sort of 2 different projects. And you're like, okay, how do I solve this? That's a problem. Number 3 is spending a lot of resources on details really early on. So you start to, as an art director, sometimes they start criticizing little details, like let's move the little armor up this way, when the bigger picture isn't even established yet. And that is a huge problem in terms of money wasting, because it doesn't matter. And later I'll talk about why. Another one is a lack of strong art direction, resulting in a scattered art department. And that sometimes results in people quitting on you, because they might be having fun getting paid, but when the studio is scattered, the artist is going to have no goal. They're working towards nothing. They're working like, okay, I'm just drawing cool stuff, but the studio doesn't seem to know what they're doing. So they'll be like, okay, I'll go somewhere else and quit on you. So that happens. Now, another one will be obscure or confusing design goals, which relates to the thing I just mentioned. You're designing every day, but you're not really sure what you're going towards. So you're like, hey, design this boss level, design this zone. You're like, what is this serve? What's the main purpose of this thing? What's the bigger picture? And the last one, of course, I like to call it the coffin corner of design. I think some of you guys, especially in the indie side, might know what this problem is say you have $1 million in funding and you start messing around with the designs, you start messing around with technology, but at some point you're going to have to make this game. So you get stuck in this zone where like you're not happy with it, but you have to make it, otherwise your money runs out. So I call that the coffin corner, and it's a very big problem in smaller studios. The bigger studios, they can afford the burn, so they could go forward, but still, you're talking about hundreds of millions perhaps lost if you go into this corner. And it's very dangerous, and if you don't have the money, you could actually result in the studio dying. So what we're doing right now is actually rescuing a lot of these studios. They have a script, they have some designs, but it's just everywhere, and you're like, okay, this is not working. You almost have to scratch everything and start from zero. So with some very basic design thinking, again, not difficult at all, you can just solve these problems. And that results in you establish the overall design direction very early on. That's what I like to do. That's what our studio specializes in. We kind of go in and just clean house and just puts everybody on the same page, right? That's the second line there. Now the art department, no matter how many concept guys you have, 1 or maybe 10, they all know what we're doing. They have a very clear goal, and it's going to be on the wall. And later I'll illustrate and help you guys see how to do that. Next one is clear vision among the team, and not just for artists and designers. Maybe sometimes the concept guys know what we're doing, but don't forget there are producer guys, programmers, sound engineers, all sorts of people. And when you have a clear cohesion, they also know what they're doing, especially for concept guys. How many guys here are designers, I wonder? Oh, quite a few, about half, right? So don't forget, what you guys do, the rest of the company is going to spend their next 2, 3 years, maybe 7 years producing what you're producing. So you got to get them excited as well. There's like babies born on projects, right? Marriages and divorce, all sorts of stuff happens on a marriage. So, but you're like in the beginning of that phase, and you want to excite the entire studio. Same with producers. They want to produce stuff that's going to help them do their careers. So by having an early cohesion, it helps them all just want to come to work the next day. All right, next one will be help estimate budgets, which is another one. For artists, you might not care too much, but for producer types, this is a really important factor. When your art is all over the place, everything's scattered. You can't talk to VFX companies, you can't talk to mocap companies because you don't know what you need. So you're just kind of guessing. And when you have this stuff down, it's much easier to budget and save money. And of course, it also results in very marketable designs, things that's going to sell this product versus making it look cool. As a concept artist and as a designer myself, sometimes we focus too much on the art and not focus on the bigger picture, which is way more important than the grass blades and so forth that you're drawing. The game or the films don't care about that, and I'll talk about that as well. And the last one, of course, is the project heads down the correct path. The way I like to explain to our clients when we're dealing with them is kind of like having a little baby. Everyone's IP is a little baby, right? They're born like 0 years old, and you're gonna really want to take care of this little baby. So what an IP company do, like such as ours, is that we take a little baby and really take care of it until it's about 5 or 6 years old. At that point, they're probably going down the right path. It's like, okay, are they gonna be well educated, or are they gonna be a dropout, right? That's what we're doing with your baby. So by the time we hand it back to the studio, hopefully it's in good hands and it's already going down the right path. All right, so that means before we start drawing anything, we're going to establish a bigger picture. Let me talk a little slower so I don't burn through this too quick. So I put a little thing on the bottom. This is for the artists out there, right? So it's like, do you know the plot of the original Star Wars movies? Which I think most of us do. But do you remember the exact design of the X-Wing cockpit layout? I don't think so. I have watched the film at least 50 times, I think, right? I watched when I was young and watching in school. I watched when working on Star Wars over and over. I have no idea what the heck is in front of Luke's thing. I know there's some screens, some red, but I don't know what is laid out. I don't even know what Darth Vader's little thing is. You know, he's got that little thing in front. I don't know, it's got buttons on it or a strap. I don't know. But I know exactly what's going on in Star Wars. I know exactly who the good guy is. I know exactly who the bad guys are. I know exactly what the plot's going. I even know the lines of the films, but I don't know the details. That means the bigger picture overrides a lot of things. But as artists, we tend to focus on those things first, which is like art critiquing, you know, where the button go and things like that. I've learned when I used to art direct when I was younger, you tend to do that with artists because you have to feel like you have to do something. So when the guy's doing concept, like, okay, you move this, move now, I'm completely different. Now I step way back because you realize those things are not that important. I learned that working with other art directors as well, because the clients, who are the final audience, they don't see that at all. All they feel is the experience. So sometimes you're nitpicking the position of a fountain, you know, 5 heads versus 4. Doesn't matter because the audience doesn't know the other ones existed in the first place. What they want to know is it a fountain and does it spray water? That's all they need to know. So make sure you establish a bigger picture. And here's some stuff to help with that. All right, next one is, well, things to help you. Know your budget. Okay, this is for especially for smaller studios. We deal with this all the time. Studios with lower budgets, sometimes they don't realize how much money they have and how quickly that could burn out. So when you have a lower budget versus a high, here are some points you should consider. You don't have to follow it, but this is the advice we give to studios, especially when their budgets are low. We're talking about 1 million to maybe 20 million. That's still considered quite low. For films in China right now, their high would be considered about 30 million, which doesn't even make a drama here in the US. But 30 million is quite high in Asia. So with that kind of money, we almost develop backwards. We have okay, when do you want your film to come out? 2019? We do the backwards charting of how we're going to spend your money. Because if you're not careful, you could run out of money very quickly. And the most dangerous thing is to run out of money about 60% into your project. Because you'd be like, okay, we could raise more cash at that point. We're out of money. But investors are very smart. They know that you're out of money. They know you're at 60%. Now they're going to offer you terms that's going to screw your company. Right? They'll be like, okay, good, well, we'll finish your project, but now we'll take about 95% of your profits. Things like that. And you're stuck. Either you take the money or you die. And they know that, and they'll actually wait until you're about to die. They'll be like, yeah, we're not interested. And they'll call you back like 2 weeks later. Are you still looking for money? They're like, we're still alive. They'll be like, okay, hang the phone. They're going to wait till the last minute till you're out of cash. They know that. So what we try to do is we want to prevent clients from getting into that situation in the first place. So let's go over some of these real quick. So if you have a lower budget, okay, again, considering this is not you have to do, but these are things we advise our clients. Most likely, your film or your game is going to take on a darker lighting palette and silhouette. And you see this in movies all the time. All your zombie films, all your Matrixes, Dark City, even the first Star Wars film. These are all films taking place in the dark, because the darker something is, the cheaper it is to make, right? Alien is another one. Because you don't have to hide the mistakes. They're hidden automatically by darkness. If you have a high budget, then you can do the brighter stuff, the palettes, front lit. So films like Minority Report, the new Star Wars films, the second Matrix films, and the third Matrix film, but not the first Matrix film, right? Because they got more money. Same thing with The Hobbit, the first Lord of the Rings compared to The Hobbit. Very different movies because budgets explodes and they do all sorts of crazy stuff with it. Next one would be the destroyed, messy, functional over form designs. When you have lower budget, consider maybe going to that style. It saves money. That's why you see a lot of post-apocalyptic games, zombie games, and so forth coming from the indie side because it's cheaper. Again, tiny mistakes. If you don't have to make your texture perfect, you don't have to make sure the road is straight because you just call it up to destruction, right? It saves money. Next is using existing objects and locations versus coming up with new ones. So shoot in existing places, just like the original Star Wars. They shot in the deserts, in the snow areas. They didn't try to make new landscapes. They just used whatever exists and put your story on top of that. Again, this sounds like common sense, but sometimes we read the scripts and we're like, dude, you got $10 million and you're trying to do like 10 different planets. There's no way to do this. You don't have the money unless you want to make it really crappy looking. There's no way to do it. I'm talking about films here. Games, at least you can use certain styles. But films, it's just impossible. You can't shoot that many locations. Next one will be ordinary materials. Again, this applies more for the film side. But sometimes you're dealing with costumes. You want to use carbon fiber. You want to use titanium. These are things that's out of the, there's no way. You don't have the budget to afford such things. So just stick with regular materials, plastic, metals, and woods to build your sets. Reusable assets, another important one. So you could shoot the same scenes over and over. And same thing with games. You build assets that are repeatable. Versus in the AAA side, they could build every single level from scratch. I remember working on one not too long ago, and they have so much money. And it's one of those AAAs that has unlimited budget. They just build every level from scratch. They don't even use the stuff from the old level to the new one because it doesn't matter to them. And if the level doesn't work, they just kill the whole thing and they just build another one. But you can't do that in the more less budget things. Okay, simpler blocky forms, going back to the lower budget. So easier to make. Next is use practical proving solution. This is an important one I want to mention, is that when you're doing your first project, especially with your first IP, you don't have to push boundaries. It's okay to do very normal things. It's okay to do a product that's good, that doesn't have to change the industry or prove out new technology, because it's risky. And unless you have a lot of experience, it's something that just raises risk. Because sometimes clients want to try new shots or try a new method. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just be aware of it. You know, because Matrix did do bullet time, and that turned out quite cool. But these are things that you have to make sure that your budget covers if you want to try something that's completely out of the ordinary. Versus staying with, okay, how did that studio do this? How did they do that? Okay, let's just use whatever they have. Another one is smaller teams. You have to hire teams, make sure that they know many things. You can't hire one guy for one thing, one guy for one thing. You don't have the money for it. So you try to get a concept guy that goes to do a little bit 3D and maybe do some animation. It's just part of the course. And the last one, which I mentioned in the beginning, is a very short development cycle. So if you have a little bit low budget, you're maximum out probably about 2 years or so, maybe 3 years if you're lucky. But some studios don't do that. They'll have just unlimited running time, and they'll run out of money, and then they're screwed. So we generally, when I get into a studio these days, we just chart out, we find an empty wall somewhere, and we mark out, okay, what year does your money basically stretch to? And we go, okay, last to about 2018, and we literally go backwards in terms of how we produce it. It's like, okay, this, how much time we need for this, how much time for that, to get it out. Of course, on a higher budget, all that stuff goes out the window. So you can have clean, organized forms, you can have new designs, exotic locations, just like the new Star Wars films. You can have expensive materials. I remember talking to some of my friends who worked on the Tron film, and that was a pretty expensive film. They were talking about how hard it was to make the glass cover for the helmets, because at that tolerance level, right? Remember, the helmets are really tight, right? They're really tight to the face. So you don't realize as an audience member that that's actually very complex to do, because at that tolerance level, that form is going to bend the actor's face. It's going to distort it, just like looking through a cup, right? Like this. So you put it in my face, it's going to warp on the edges. So they're like, okay, this is not going to work. So they actually went in and CG'd the crap out of this thing to distort the reverse distortion. So they actually, 3D print the glass or whatever method they use, that it actually is distorted, but when you put it on, it reverses distortion. You can only do that when you have that kind of money, you know what I'm saying? Because when they first put it on, the actor's face all like big and chubby on this side and skinny on this side, right? Like a funny mirror. So they did all this crazy work, but as an audience member, you don't even know. You're just like, oh, that looks good. What's so hard about that? So, and they were hiding the batteries. Those Tron suits literally light up by themselves. They were not CG'd. They have batteries in them. So they're hiding them up the spine, up the neck, up the top of the head, all 3D printed to make sure it works, and using special batteries and all sorts of stuff. If you're working with low budgets, you just cannot afford to do those kind of things. Next one would be new assets for everything. We mentioned that. Complex organic forms, use VFX, new technologies. You can have a huge team if you want, and long dev cycles that generally last 3 to 5 years. Okay, so this is a little bit of a common sense thing to know. Next one. Boink. Okay. Who is your audience? I hope these slides don't sound so common sense, but really, it's sometimes people forget about who you're making your game or films for, because you have to identify your audience. They have different needs. This is just one example, by the way. There's many different audiences. I'm just kind of putting a basic one. For example, younger versus mature. when we're designing for younger people, they tend to have things that are very flashy, like Iron Man suits and so forth. It just looks really cool. You have high detail. They like to have the density, just like the Iron Man suits, right? Or Transformers. Exaggerated shapes. They like wild rides. And the last one is designs that doesn't really have to have any underlying meaning. As long as it looks kind of cool, it's good. But you're dealing with a little bit more mature audience, they tend to like their designs a bit functional. For example, the Martian film that came out recently. That's a lot of functionality. I don't know if young kids will like that film, but that's definitely a mature movie. You have a lot of human stories, especially love, relationship, these things you build in. You could do your film or game in a slower pace. You mix a lot of cultural understanding, things that goes back 20, 30 years because your audience knows what those references are, versus younger ones, they don't even get it, right? So if you're referencing The Shining, the film, they might not even know what you're referencing, right? Or like 88 miles an hour or something like that. And the last one is the deeper meaning in designs, which we'll talk about later, is we hide a lot more subliminal stuff into designs. And for me, that's way more important sometimes than the details, because I feel that when you're watching a film or playing a game, you feel the experience, you don't look at the experience. Like I play Skyrim, I play a lot of games, but I actually don't know the exact details, but I feel it. It's just like Star Wars, you feel it. So our job is to design that feeling, because when you walk away from that game or film, you have a certain experience, but I don't think your experience ever, oh, the tile of that film was awesome, or that texture on that wall of the game made it what it is. It's not. It's, man, that when I walked in that thing, I felt all massive or really small. That's the kind of stuff you feel. So mature audiences tend to like that type of thing. Next one, how serious your IP. Another common sense thing that sometimes our clients don't consider. Okay, so I have some examples of serious IPs versus entertaining IPs versus lighthearted. When you have serious IPs like Private Ryan or Beast of No Nation, you don't put slipping on banana jokes in the, you don't put like fart jokes. But sometimes you read these scripts and you're like, what, where is this film going? Why is it like kind of serious and then it's like suddenly not so serious anymore? You don't know. And same thing with video games, right? Life is Strange is a pretty serious game. They don't do, slipping on banana type of stuff in their games. Then you have the entertainment, which is purely there to entertain you. You could put all sorts of stuff in there. The whole point is that you're just on a wild coaster ride. Lighthearted, of course, your Disney animations, you feel good type of IPs. Now, why do we do this? Because from a design point of view, if you're on the serious side, say Private Ryan, you can't design mechs and giant swords, things sticking out of their armor, because it doesn't go with the IP. Your IP is about the human story here, and we start doing those crazy designs, it starts to take away from the seriousness of the IP. And these are things, again, from the script side, you're like, wow, this is a pretty hardcore script, and all of a sudden, it's like the big giant mech shows up, and like, whoa, this is what happened? Now it's entertainment IP, right? So identify where you're trying to take your IP and stick with it. All right, next one. And this is the thing I like to do with our students, which is keep it simple when starting. You can make it complex later, but keep it simple when starting out. Because sometimes our students don't do this, right? So I pick a few IPs that you can summarize. If you can summarize your IP in a single sentence, it's probably pretty strong. So here are some examples, right? So robots in the future, time travel to terminate human rebellion leader. Pretty simple. Most people probably know what that is. Next one, young female archaeologists travel the world searching for lost tombs, killing bad guys. Right. Next one, epic space opera between forces of good and evil in a galaxy far, far away. Next, the world we live in is actually a computer simulation created by robot slavers. You read this to most people, they don't know what your IP is. And the following, the travel through time in a modified DeLorean, right? And the last one, bald-headed guy with barcode killing people, right? It's straightforward, but it's easy because when you're dealing with students or maybe clients with less experience, like, okay, our IP is about World War II and it's about Germans fighting Americans, but actually the Soviets are an alien race from another planet, and the planet created a fourth dimension, and using the fourth dimension, they sent the CIA, which became the US, and they're backstabbing Britain. You're like, what is going on in your IP? One of those things is good enough. World War II between Germany and America is good enough of an IP. That is enough. And you look, Private Ryan's made an entire movie off of that. If you can add a little bit things to it, sure. But start it simple, because sometimes our special students, they start it way too complex, thinking that's what makes the IP interesting. But it's not. Simplicity is what makes it interesting. Star Wars and these Terminator, they're very simple stories. They don't have a lot of this stuff going on. So maybe you guys are working on IPs and see if you can summarize whatever you're working on in a single sentence. If it gets too complex and you have to use and then, like probably 3 times, it might be a little complex right now. Because we do that with students all the time. It's like, okay, I just did one last week critiquing a student. It was something like gargoyles have powers and then the crystal from another thing. And then this guy trying to get the crystal so he can end the world, so he can make another world. He's like, dude, what is going on? It's so complex. And it makes design very challenging. All right. So now I'm going to give you some tips in terms of when you're designing, things to think about. And IPs generally all involve conflicts. Okay, good versus evil, poor versus rich, some kind of conflict. So from a design point of view, you could do the exact same thing. In fact, this film came out recently, Disney movie, Zootopia. The entire movie is a conflict film. Later, maybe we could use that film as an example. Right? Some of you guys seen the film, or even the trailer, right? You look at it, it's like little herbivores versus carnivores. It's a small little thing versus a big thing. A little rabbit versus giant rhino cop. The little rabbit comes on the farm versus a giant city. The entire movie, which contrasts, the rabbit is very fast, the little sloth is very slow. So they actually use it. And the reason why is because contrast makes everything stronger. If you want good, you have to have bad. If you want small, you have to have big. And these following slides talk about those things. So the first thing we do is we look at your story. So if you have an IP, you have a game or a film, find a wall somewhere, the biggest wall you can find, a long one, and try to lay this out. This is exactly what we do. Right now I fly to China, we find some wall in the hallway, and we just, okay, let's tape it with paper, get a big marker, and let's do this with the IP. The top part is the mood, the bottom is the tension. Tension is pretty simple. It's basically an upwards curve until the end of the movie. But mood is generally divided by acts. Now video games fall into this as well. Well, most games, I guess Tetris and puzzle games and match 3s and stuff don't count. But I'm talking about games that have a very structured story, like a film. So you have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, right? Very simple things. But there are things that are happening here. For example, in Act 1, you have generally a high point to start the IP. Then you have a mid-off point, right? Most films have this, like Transformers. You have some kind of big battle in the beginning. And then you go into a low, the build-up. That's where you establish your story, the conflict, everything that's happening. And then you generally hit a small low. In Zootopia, that was when, I don't want to spoil the film too much, but it's when the rabbit couldn't prove that something was happening. Do you remember that a creature escapes, right? So that was a little bit low point. And then you go into a high point, and then you go to a massive low point. And in Zootopia, again, is when the rabbit character sort of gives up, right, what she's doing. So the audience member, you also feel like giving up with the main character. And then, of course, they have to go through that arc and solve it. Now, this is very common. Most of you guys probably know this. So this is not why we do this. The reason why we do this, by charting this out, we can identify the important points to start your design. Instead of starting from step number 1, step number 2, for a film, we could generally identify about 12 to 14 points that we could start designing. And that's where we do the contrast. For example, you're doing Lord of the Rings. The last final frame is Mordor, right? Okay, boom, we put Mordor. That must be a shot we have designed. What's right before it? Okay, right before we go to Mordor is a low point, right? Gandalf dies, remember that? So as a design chart, you're like, okay, let's work this out. What's going on in this? Is it Gandalf? Or are you laughing? Okay, I hope I said that right. It's Gandalf. Is it Gandalf? Okay, I got it right? Gandalf dies, he falls down the pit, remember that? And then all the dwarves are all sad, right? That's a low point. So why do we have that? It's because as a design, we're going to contrast the crap out of these 2 points. As we mentioned, red, tall, high, blue, low, sad. Okay, these are things, and I'll talk about those things. So by charting this out, as your concept designers are designing these things, we're going to put those concepts under these categories. Here I only have 8 examples, which are high, midpoint, build-up, small payoffs. And you look at your design and go, does it match the point in this IP as it's supposed to? Does this piece mean it's a high point? Is it a low point? Is it sad? Is it happy? And we'll go through these. Another contrast is your character contrast. Another thing that sometimes our students forget, they'll design completing the void, making bad guys confusing, making good guys confusing. So you have an antagonist, which is your bad guy. Doesn't have to be a bad guy. It could be an event, like an earthquake is an antagonist. Post-apocalyptic nuclear war could be a bad guy. So generally, the bad guy is going to intersect in Act 2, the confrontation. And the good guy is going to rise up, your protagonist. And the good guys, generally what they need to do is they have to make key decisions. Okay? Without those decisions, the story won't go forward. Like the rabbit in Zootopia talking with the fox character. Next one is overcome obstacles, including themselves, and overcome conflict, and the reason why. Okay? Now, why does this matter for designers? Because it matters to you in terms of what the character does, their behavior, what they wear. I'll give you an example of even some of our students. The story could be, bad guy wants to destroy the world. Okay, fine, if that's what you want to do. But then the bad guy lives in a beautiful mansion, collects history, has books, dresses nicely. I'm like, why is he doing all this and he wants to destroy the world? Because his character is conflicting with his own personal interest. If he wants to destroy the world, he won't be wearing Armani suits and collecting history, because that's a person who wants to preserve the world, right? And sees beauty in having statues in his house. Then why does he want to just demonize things? So those are things that comes up. And you mentioned to a student, like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Imagine that on a real project in which you're spending all this cash funding it and you run into that kind of issue. So you want to resolve this pretty early on. What is the need of the good guys and what is the need of the bad guy? Of course, the antagonist on the bottom there is they create the conflict, okay, either naturally like an earthquake or they want to do it as a person. They create obstacles for the good characters, and with those obstacles could be anything, but some kind of obstacle from love through, and lastly, they get defeated or resolved. So that's your character contrast. Next one, blink, is technology contrast. Okay, so these are all design things. Map your IP out, again, going back to here, okay, and look for who you're fighting, who's your good, who's your bad, who's the rich, who's the poor, whatever your contrast is, and start thinking, okay, can I use technology contrast? Is it low-tech versus high-tech? Is it natural versus man-made? And stick with it. Star Wars is a perfect example. Jedis are using swords, essentially, low technology versus a very high technology. You look at where Yoda lives, you look at where Luke lived, warm color palettes, very grounded, very Earth-like. You look at the Empire, it's completely cold. And later we'll get to some of the design things they use, repetitive, monochrome. These are contrasts. So when you're watching the film, you're going from one scene to another. You feel that change. And these are things that, especially nowadays with graphics being so good, we do see studios making mistakes where everything looks good. So you're going from one area, it's all crazy. You go to the next area, it's all crazy too. Go next one. And then after about 3 levels, your mind is already just completely resolved. It's just too much that you don't get this contrast. You need this kind of balance. So even natural, right? The Ewoks versus man-made things like this Death Star. Yeah, sounds so simple, but gets lost a lot when we work on these projects. All right, next one is scale contrast. If you want something to look tall, build something that's short. Right? Don't do tall and then tall and then tall. Let's go back to Lord of the Rings, Mordor, the Sauron's tower. Not only is it a tower, it's also on top of a volcano, right? So it's like tall on tall. And then who's going there? Bunch of hobbits who are really short, who comes from Hobbiton, who's really low. That contrast is great. And even with colors, hobbits are green and very peaceful, Mordor's dead and red, and we'll get to that as well. So contrast it. We see students doing giant monsters, walking in tall buildings. Okay, the contrast already got canceled out because the tall buildings are already tall and your monster's big. They're not going to feel huge anymore. If you want a huge monster, put them in an open field somewhere or have little villages they could stomp on. So that way they feel big. Next is big versus small. Okay, if you want something to look huge, put something really small next to it. If you want something small, put something really big next to it. So yeah, Zootopia, right? The little rabbit versus her boss, which is that bison-looking guy, right? A huge contrast. And even with the fox that the rabbit's with, still a major contrast. You get that in almost all your animation features. Disney has all this stuff down, and this is all they do, which is clean their IPs to such a high level. So it's a good way to kind of study IPs as well, look at some of their stuff. But yeah, if you want big, small, small, big. Last one, if you want narrow, then put something wide, right? One game that does this quite well, I thought, is Assassin's Creed. You walk around narrow little streets, and when you get to the roof, it feels very, very open. So you get a nice little contrast. And you go down below, it feels a little narrow. So they generally don't do giant areas in the Creed games. I think it's quite good. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it works really well in terms of contrast. And these are just some examples, by the way, right? I can't write everything down. But from a design point of view, again, let's go back to here, right? Say your high point is a bad guy's place, and you want it to be massive and huge. Then you put those designs I just mentioned, okay, right before it, let's make sure we go somewhere really small and tiny, right? So you create that contrast, okay. Next one is shape contrast as well as culturally established things. For example, I have safe versus dangerous. There are certain elements that tells you something is dangerous, like spikes, skulls, empty forest with fog, fangs from a tarantula, a hospital. These are things that are spooky, and there's nothing wrong with using these culturally established things for your IP. because it takes a lot of money to change your mind. I showed this to our students before. You see that little puppy right there? We can make that puppy evil. We can. But it takes more time and money to make it do so, because we have to introduce dialogue. We have to introduce some kind of action this puppy has to do, a few things. And that still might be quite hard, because our audience might be like, is this for real, or are they really trying to make the puppy evil? It's because popular culture tells you big eyes and soft things are safe. So yes, you could try to make that puppy extremely evil, but that just make sure you know that's going to take time and money. You simply can't sell it as is. So same thing with the spikes. You could make a spiky castle made out of dark materials and oblivion and say this is the fairy queen's awesome, nice area. That's a really hard sell. But our thing is, this works its way into IPs. We read these things like, man, this looks like a bad guy's hangout, but no, it's a police station. And it's like really weird. So same thing with guys hanging out. A lot of people laughing, emotions on their faces, food, bedding. These are all things that says safe. So if you're designing an inn, do you have these elements in the inn? Are people laughing? Is there food on the table? Because these are culturally established things. And as a teacher, we're always telling students to stick with this. You don't have to always do something different. Culturally established thing is perfect. And again, go back to Zootopia. I just watched that film, that's why I keep mentioning it. They hit everything exactly what you think it should hit. But look at the film, it did really well. It's actually quite interesting. Look at their police station, look at the DMV. They didn't change a single thing. I was telling our students, they could have made the DMV, that's not spoiling anything, right, because it's in the trailers. But it looks like a DMV. But imagine get a junior designer in there who's like, I have to do this different. So let's make the sloth, the DMV like on trees and make them hang upside down, give them some weird little panel things for a computer. They didn't do any of that. The only thing they changed with there is at the sloth, because that's what makes that IP stand out. Everything else was grounded and DMV-like. So that way you as an audience member know what you're looking at. Okay. Next one's emotional contrast. This is something we tell our clients, because especially out in Asia, for science fiction and fantasy films, they tend to forget this. They do their emotional stuff really, really well, like dramas and love stories and so forth. But even if you do fantasy and science fiction, all this is in there. So here's some examples of, for example, you're designing something that has a live, right? I keep going back to this over here, right? Say your build-up is in an area that has full of life, where you have a character that's full of life. How do you represent that? Okay, you can use design to do so. For example, there are plants in this person's room. It signals life. There is movement of air, like wind. Okay? There are changing of seasons. The materials are more natural. You have sunlight. You take it for granted, but these are things that human nature we know means something is living. The opposite, if we go to this despair, which is the Death Star, for example, you get things like repetitive shapes. You get a pressure. And right now, we're on a film right now, we're actually using these terms, because imagine you're designing a very depressive area, a very depressive society. Well, you can make the ceilings really low and made out of heavy cement. Automatically, you'll feel that pressure on you because it's heavy. And these are what I'm talking about is the secondary designs. That's way beyond just the surface nature of the design. Especially right now at GDC, I'm looking at a lot of portfolios students come by, and a lot of the portfolio stuff is first surface designs, which is, it looks kind of cool, but doesn't go beyond that. It's like, okay, guy wearing an armor. Here's a landscape with some spikes, rocks in it. Here's a space tower, and so forth. It doesn't go beyond what is this for, what is this IP about, what story is taking place here. It doesn't consider that. And so it's just good-looking art. And it's very hard to use that kind of stuff when you start dealing with much bigger IPs. The middle one's hope. These are harder things to design, but you have a character that is the hope of this story. Okay, what can we do with that? So I put some examples, like reflection is a sign of hope. Spirituality or religion could be that. A pathway that goes upwards to see infinity, have huge entrances, and discovery like a library. And you guys play Skyrim, right? Walking into Whiterun, you have pretty much all this in one shot. Because that's the point in which you're realizing who you are, and you're basically the hero of this entire world. So you go up giant stairs, you go through a giant door. Remember that? To meet the king guy in Whiterun, right? I think they also have a library in there as well, and you also see very, very far. So intentional or not, that stuff works because you feel like you're the hero. And we could do the opposite. You're going somewhere in which you are not discovering something, we're going down the path while we go down physically. We actually just used very recently in a script, because in the script, on a film we're on right now, the main character discovers the past, right? What their past is, and their past is very good. But in the script, they wrote this character going down to find this past, going down to a basement. We're like, no, let's make them go up an attic to find this, because that means it's a rising of the character versus a lowering of the character. And they're like, what's the difference? Like, no, the audience will feel this stuff. This is what I was talking about. Instead of focusing on the X-Wing fighter cockpits, focus on this stuff first, because your audience will definitely feel this type of emotion when you design into it. Okay, check on time here. All right, good. Next one, lighting. Okay, another common sense thing, but sometimes people forget, is you want lighting that's inviting and friendly, generally comes from above, generally warm in color tone, and generally doesn't cast harsh shadows. So it's very soft. So if you want someone who's nurturing, you light it from above, you use soft lighting. The opposite, if you want something spooky, okay, straight on lighting, long shadows, silhouettes, cold reflective surfaces, harsh shadows, you establish that. So when you start putting all these things together, you start to clean up your IP in terms from a design point of view, and every concept guy now knows. And let me finish this slide so you guys can see what I mean by that. Okay, the last one before I give some tips here is the mood and contrast. So find a giant wall, right? Put this up there, like what's happening in your IP, what's going on in your story, chart it out, put all your acts in there, and then have your concept guys start doing the designs, and you can use color correction to set the mood. And this is something we do very active in the studio. So we have a huge wall, and it's like, okay, this is the bad guy, this is the good guy. Do you have any mood or color that's coherent? Here are some examples you can use. The top one is complementary, in which you start in the reds, you go into blues, and you end the reds, right? So they contrast. Everything's about contrast, right? Red and blue are contrasting colors. The next one's a ramp up, which is monochromatic into a color palette. I think you see that in the Matrix films, where they go from black and white into kind of a greenish zone. And the last one is RGB, which you use all three colors in sequence. The example here is actually BGR, which is blue, green, red. And you see Lord of the Rings use that, right? Remember the Mordor fight happens in blue, and then you go into Hobbit, which is green, and then you end the film in red. These are all contrasts. And now as an audience member, you might not even know the film is doing this, or even the game is doing that, but you will know just by experiencing it kind of mentally as you do this. So as the concept guys are producing the work, what we're doing is we're trying to match it to this chart. We're like, okay, why do we have red in the back? Do we need that? Or is it a blue? Is it a sad ending, a dramatic ending? Is it a monochromatic ending? And use color palettes to control that. So if you want a crazy giant fight at the end, it's probably going to be reddish tones. So therefore, from a design point of view, their concept art, if I pin it to that part of the story, you should have the same color palette and the same moods, right? So what you do with this is have some space below it and just pin up little thumbnails of all the design, just pin it. And it's so helpful, because when you're designing the void and everything else on a folder somewhere on the server, you're unaware of some of this stuff. And the 3D artist started building this kind of stuff, and you start watching the rough cuts, and things are all over the place, jumping all over the place. So this all kind of helps it put together. Check on time here. All right. Next one is a design tip, right? So these are the contrasts. Let me just go through it real quick, right, in terms of design. Make sure you have story contrast, character contrast, technology contrast, scale, shapes, emotional contrast. Right? This is a hard one to do, especially for our students, but spend some time, pull it off. Lighting contrast and mood contrast. And the whole way to use contrast is they're either right next to each other or is right before it. So if you want a happy moment, put a sad one in front of it. You want a tall moment, put a short one in front of it, right? You want an up moment, put a low one, or go down, right? If you want to go up towards something, make them go down first, right? These are contrasts. So now is a little bit design balance. This is something I do see at GDC quite a lot in student portfolios, in which the design is just too much. There's too much design. The general stuff that works very safely is 90% grounded, 10% crazy. Crazy not in a bad way. Crazy is your IP, okay? That makes it unique. But 10% is about right. And then 90% is things that are relatable to humans. The stuff I talked about last year at GDC. It's cultural, it's everyday stuff, it's grounded designs, real world references, it doesn't confuse your audience. That's 90% of your IP. So actually, all you gotta do is focus on 10% of design. Saves a ton of cash, saves tons of money, and make sure you get all the previous contrasts in there. I put a couple IPs down there to illustrate this example. Like Persona, for those who know, is a pretty crazy game out of Japan, right? You like midnight, you go into like some demon world and you're fighting monsters. Really over the top. They have to shoot themselves in the head, something like that. But to balance that out, you're in high school, and the high school is Earth and Japan as it gets. You go to school, you learn classes, you go on dates, you go to sushi bars, right? It's all grounded, and that contrast makes it work really well. But the game is really 90% taking place in the real world, 10% in crazy. Same with Metal Gear Solid. A lot of crazy stuff going on there. But what did they do? They set it in Afghanistan. It looks like 1980s Afghanistan. They didn't put on an alien planet with alien creatures, alien humans versus alien machines. When you start doing that, now there's some IPs that can pull that off, but it's very expensive. When you're a smaller IP and trying to do that, it's very hard to sell because that's what we see in portfolios. Right? Space Marine on a foreign planet fighting crazy space aliens using crazy guns. Nothing is grounded. And you look at that like, woo, just go over here, it's like, what is going on? Because the students don't have enough work to convince me that this IP is cool. They only show me one piece. I don't know who these characters are. I don't know who the aliens are. So it just comes off very, very confusing. It's too much stuff versus, say, a soldier standing on the cliff top looking at a village down below and trying to snipe somebody. I get it. I know exactly what's going on. Okay, bad guy sniping, he's in a Vietnam village. Okay, I already get that. But you don't see that much, especially from the student side or portfolios. Even Assassin's Creed, pretty crazy IP, guy with a knife going around, stabbing a bunch of people. But they always set it in the real world. The one I put here is sailing around in real ships, real oceans, real landmarks, versus sailing around in crazy ships, unknown locations, alien planets, water that's floating in the air, right? All sorts of stuff. But believe it or not, students do this. When they put on the wall, you're like, what is going on? Everything is designed. Well, not to design. Everything has to be different. Cannot put real world. They don't put anything real. Everything is made up, including the characters, costume, everything. And what happens is you have to do a lot of work to sell that type of IP. A lot of money, tons of concept art, because you're resetting everything we know about the world, right? Versus, say you put it in the Bahamas in tall ships. We know how that works. Even crazy films like Aliens has a lot of real world. They have space marines that are very down to earth, right? James Cameron made that famous. The Vietnam type of space marines. They're not trained. They're trained, but they're all like goofing off. They talk crap, right? They're hitting each other. The slapstick marines. That's coined pretty much like James Cameron. That contrast made that film stand out. Same with the first Alien, in which you got a bunch of miners who are not Marines at all, fighting something that's very military. So you have that nice story contrast, and that grounds it. Imagine the story is a bunch of badass Marines, all military trained, fighting a badass alien. Your contrast is gone, and you have the audience removed, because we're not Marines ourselves. We don't know the tactical stuff. So you start doing these high-level things, you're going to lose your audience. So yeah, we had another student recently design something like this, which is like, on an alien world, these alien people are hunting alien creatures. So you look at the concept, the buildings are crazy, the plants are crazy, the aliens are crazy, the weapons are crazy, the people are not even people. So you look at that as like, what part of this am I supposed to like or relate to? I can't relate to anything. So if the guy dies, who cares? Because I don't know who he is. Versus, say, a human being, right? Back to the Future, same thing, very crazy story, but 90% locked to Earth. Everything is human except for the time travel part. And Star Wars, being extremely out there, is actually extremely grounded. All the locations, I remember working on Star Wars, George told us, no planets that looks like alien. That's not Star Wars. We pitched a few, we tried it. Actually, one made it, which is Fallujah, which really surprised me. That made the cut, which is this crazy, I don't know if you've seen it. It looks like a bunch of mushrooms and crazy things. But everything else he tried got cut because George will see it and go, that's not Star Wars. Star Wars is about grounded planets. Every planet is something on Earth. So Tatooine, your Endor, your Hoth, or he says a Hoth, a couple of places, they're all very grounded to planet Earth. So that way you could relate. I think if you're flying around a TIE fighter and the world is just weird curves and all sorts of stuff, now you're no longer Star Wars. So even the new one, they did not break the rule. They stuck with it, right? You have the Endor-like planets and Tatooine's back in there as well. And that's a little bit about design balance. Let me go last one here, time. All right, good. And the last one for IP is find your visual hook. However, I put this as a last slide because it's not the most important. Sometimes you get into a studio and they focus too much on this first and not on their IP. They're like, okay, we're doing VR. But the thing is, what is your IP before you do the VR? Because a good IP should be able to stand on its own, disregarding its artistic style. But there are some big ones you could think of, right? Artistic style is one. Do you want your IP to look photoreal? Or are you doing this something for new technology? But if your IP is strong, for example, Legend of Zelda, Zelda could survive as a live-action film, for sure. Zelda could also probably work as a photoreal IP. The same is true for, say, The Exorcist as a cartoon. Probably works. It's because the IP itself is extremely strong, versus starting out like it has to look photoreal. But what does that mean exactly? Or sometimes we have to stylize this IP. But what is the IP to start with? Why is spending so much time trying to make the artist trying to find its styling? Do the IP first. Once you have the story, once you have the contrast points, now you can start exploring this stuff in more detail. And same with nowadays, I go to the floors, all this VR tech. We work with a couple of companies that's doing VR as well. And sometimes they're focusing too much on the VR and not the IP itself. It's like, oh, it'd be really cool to see behind you and so forth. But you gotta remember, as human beings, as an audience, we care about the story, we care about the experience. Just because it's techy or interesting or gimmicky, it gets bored really quickly if you don't entertain them, probably within a few minutes of looking at it. So our advice generally would go in with, because there are a couple of VR movies that we're looking at, and we're just kind of treating it exactly like a real movie. It's like, forget the VR part first, let's get the film doing good first, and then we insert the VR back into it, versus like you start the film and you could look behind you for some reason. So we're kind of disregarding that. So coming to an end here, the last one is my little checklist, yeah? So this is something we're gonna give our students as well, which is you can build yourself a little checklist and you can look at your own IPs or your own game or films and just kind of write your own answer and see like, can you answer it? So, what is your budget? Do you have a lot of money? How much is your time? Those two are tied together. Who are you building this game for? How serious are you trying to treat your IP? And your one-line summary. I think that's one of the hardest ones. Okay, so maybe some of you guys could try with whatever game you're working on and try to summarize it. Again, it doesn't apply to everything, right? If you have like a Tetris, actually Tetris, you could probably summarize it too. But if you're doing like puzzle games and so forth, it probably doesn't work. I'm generally talking about story-driven IPs. So what is the one-liner? And then of course all the contrasting points that we have there. And the last one, which is the hook. Not that important, and hooks could change. We worked on projects that started out as animations that went to live action. I worked on live action that went to animation, but the IP never changed. So it shows you that if you have a strong IP with the emotional and all the attachments and stories, you don't necessarily sometimes have to stick with a certain style. So yeah, so that's my little advice here for IP creation. I guess I could open up to some questions. You guys find this interesting? I hope. Yeah. All right, cool, thank you. Thanks, guys. I left 10 minutes for QA. All right, good, perfect. So we have 2 mics on the side. If you guys have questions, you guys could ask anything. It doesn't be related to this, by the way. I'm gonna take a quick photo while I'm up here. So, questions? Yay, fun. All right, good. All right, we got some questions.
Hi.
Yo.
Okay. How do you think the 3-act structure can help in creating story for IP backgrounds, story backgrounds for games? Do you think it still applies?
Well, I think this will apply mostly for games that has a story arc similar to a film. So if your game is just, say, puzzles or something that just goes level to level and level, I don't think this applies at all.
But if you're trying to create a world where you can create a lot of stories, do you think there's some way to translate that?
I mean, if you have a story in your IP, definitely, you pretty much have to follow it. I mean, this is classic Hollywood stuff here, and very few films stay away from this. You get a few, like Pulp Fiction and so forth. Quentin Tarantino generally breaks these rules, but most of your films, even the new Star Wars and Zootopia, they follow this to a T. So you can actually put those films out on this chart, and it's exactly this chart. So that's why I say, if you're building your first IP, you haven't done it too many, keep it safe. It works, and Hollywood uses it, and they've proven successful with it. So do it, be successful at it, and then if you make tons of cash, and then try something. That's why I tell our clients all the time, because sometimes they overdo it, like, well, then we'll do a sequel. No. You need to make money first with the first one, and then we could talk about the sequels and everything else. So yeah, hopefully it helps.
All right. Thank you.
Question that side?
Yeah, so you spoke pretty early on the slide about getting the big picture, the one-sentence IP nailed before you start worrying about the size of the dials and the bolts.
Yep.
A lot of times you'll be on a project where you ramp up fairly significantly, so you have a large team. A large team, you just figure that out. It's usually a very small group of people.
Yes.
So do you have any tips for kind of keeping it small or coming to that conclusion when you have a larger team that really isn't needed?
Well, that's your producer hiring a lot of people before the project kicks off, I guess. So what we're trying to do right now is we actually hold the team hiring until that stuff is ready, because then you're burning a lot of 3D artists' money and stuff for no reason. Because you get into trouble because you make them doing stuff and they actually make good stuff, but maybe it doesn't even fit your IP. But you have to use it because you spend money doing it. So I think the ideal case would be like you don't ramp up the giant team until this part's clean. LA does that. Most films, we worked on it for about 6 months to a year, and the team is tiny. I mean, Star Wars is like 6 people for a year and a half. There's nobody else involved, just 6 people. And George, of course. That's it. Even I was working with James Cameron, next door is Avatar. Tiny, it's like one room that the whole team is in it. You know what I'm saying? And that lasts about a year. And then once it's good, once it's clean, boom, the team just goes like 300 people. So it's also to do with the producers, I guess, is like don't have too many overhead too early. Yeah? So but it's hard to solve that. It's a hard problem if you already have people. Maybe put them on some fun projects to use up their time, or study things, another one. So
thank you.
All right.
Yeah, I just want to say great talk, great information.
Thank you.
I was wondering about your advice about developing iconic characters for an IP. What kind of best practices, advice?
Sure. This applies as well. Basically, have contrast for your characters. Like I mentioned earlier, if the guy wants to destroy the world, why is he wearing nice clothes and having nice materials? So you have to look at your characters and what does he stand for? The slide that, where's my little clicker here? That goes after this one. Right? Identify what is their ultimate goal. Why is this hero trying to do, or what is the bad guy trying to do? And does everything he's wearing, designing, living, doing fit that goal? So, I mean, look at Mordor, for example, like Sauron. His whole thing is about just destroying the world. So he doesn't have nice living places. He doesn't have furniture. He doesn't have anything because he doesn't care. So nor does the orcs have. So those are things important. Even though they are big creatures, they are characters. Versus the hobbits, who is about living and preserving life. You look at their house. They have houses. They have books they're writing. They're about longevity. The orcs don't care. So these are it's simple, but it gets lost sometimes because we see students doing designs that are unnecessary. It's like if your character is this, why are they doing that? Because they will never do that if that's intention. And same thing with the wear, the materials they choose, the type of weapons even they use has to do with who they are. So you have to get your story, this part out and trying to figure out what is this character trying to do. So write stuff out, chart it out. Hope that helps. All right, over there.
Thank you. How would you apply this approach to like a non-linear story? Like a video game where you can at some point determine where you go in what order.
But no matter what, it has to have some kind of arc, I imagine. Because you cannot have a story that has no arc at all, right? Because if you're playing a game, there's got to be some kind of goal, especially if it's story-driven. If it's purely puzzle or points-related, maybe not, but even games like Diablo and so forth, there's some kind of goal you're getting to. So you can still, even if you have a non-linear path, you can still chart these out into different paths and hit the lows, hit the highs, and so forth. So if you have like 5 different paths, you got to just lay this out 5 different times and just make sure that they're hitting these things. But I guess it's a little bit harder for non-linear. But having contrast or having these high lows is so important. This is the way I manage my art teams, because otherwise it's impossible. You have the concept guys read the script, you go, hey, draw stuff from it. It's random, because one guy will be like, I draw it this way, and one guy draws it that way, and one guy draws, and you put them all together on the wall, it's like, wow, it all looks good, but doesn't sort of make sense next to each other. So what I like to do is I physically print this out, by the way. Like when I was in China the other day, we just have a huge wall of this, and I go, okay, your team, no matter what they do, that concept art's got to go on here somewhere, right? It can't exist nowhere. So boom, we put it there and we go, okay, this design does not match the story point at where it's at. So I think you do that with non-linear games. You want someone to be sad. That's the path they take. Then write down everything that does have a sad and then feed into it. But make sure they have something happy right before it, so have the contrast. So all right, I hope that helps. Question?
Hey, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering, since many of us are in this here, and we tend to go more towards the crazy, what are some of the crazy stuff that you should avoid? Because we're working on a game with a cow with a bazooka, so it's already kind of crazy. And then we have the art style, it's also kind of crazy. We do comic book stuff and so on. That's
a hard call, because those are things it's hard to chart, like games like Angry Birds and things like that. You can't do business analyzations on it, because sometimes they're a hit simply due to the fact they're fun or good looking. They don't fall into a general category. But if you have cow bazookas, then my guess is that you probably want to ground the world So you make sure you're fighting probably on a farm or something like that. So that way there's something grounded. If it's Cal with a bazooka on an alien planet, you might lose interest after a little bit because the gimmick runs out pretty quickly. But if it's on a farm, you can always introduce farm things, I guess, to keep the gimmick going. So, but in terms of, for art students doing this as well, pick some grounded projects to start with instead of doing space. The most common thing we see here at GDC is post-apocalyptic stuff. That's the most common. Like some person with a dog walking around a post-apocalyptic place. It's in almost everyone's portfolio. And the next one is some kind of spiky mountain of some kind. So it's like this or like that or like that. And it's either alien or science fiction with a space marine looking at it. That's another one. And then the last one would be some generic fantasy. So Alvin, a warg, or an archer with a bow. Okay, that's all we see. And then you look what's out there in terms of entertainment. There's Metal Gear Solid, there's James Bond, Mission Impossible, there's what other games came out, XCOM, right? None of that has whatever the portfolios has. So our advice generally for students, especially when you're building your portfolios, build it towards the industry, don't build it for yourself. You're here to look for jobs. The jobs are right there. You can see exactly what they're doing. So you draw the stuff that they need versus drawing things because it's fun for you. So it's kind of the opposite. All right. Thank you. I think we have 2 more questions. Perfect. All right, good.
Hey, great talk. Super engaging, high octane. It was fun.
Thank you.
My question is about the entrepreneurship aspect of your career. When you decided to go in that direction, was there any point where you felt like you were without art or you needed to create?
For me, actually, quite burned when you get yelled by directors after a while. So Hollywood's a hardcore place, man. So, they get your phone number, they call you up on Sundays. It was actually Transformers. You're getting chewed out for some design you did on a Sunday afternoon. It's like, man, this is too much. And 2, like I mentioned, you reach a career peak where it's like, what's the next film? Is Iron Man or something? Like, it's the same thing, essentially. So I couldn't do anymore. And I was lucky to have saved enough money that I just took a chance. I actually talked about design cinema. It's my business partner, James Klein. One day he just casually asked me, what are you doing in 5 years? It's a very casual question. But it's one of those things where I could not answer the question. I'm like, actually, I don't know what I've been doing 5 years because I don't want to do this anymore for 5 years, which is the same thing over and over again. At that point, it was only almost, 10, 15, 12 years into it already. So I just took a gamble and started a company. I had no idea how to do it. No idea. But that was a good learning point to learn how to talk to investors and so forth. Because before I started, I did talk to a couple of my friends who are successful, like Alex Alvarez from Noman, right? He's got a successful school. And he says, look, as a designer, you already are a businessman anyways. What you guys are doing every day is selling products to the rest of the world. You have to sell your spaceship to the client. They're paying you physical money for a made-up thing. So you are an entrepreneur. Every freelancer is an entrepreneur. Every designer essentially is an entrepreneur. So I took that advice and just went for it. But it's scary. It's risky. But if you want to do it, it's fun because it's problem solving works in money and it also works in design. So, yeah. Good luck if you're doing entrepreneurship. All right. Last question.
Hi, yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
It was amazing. But I was wondering to what extent this all applies to the Asian market, because I work as a concept artist in Japan, and things can get really crazy there.
Japan is on its own. I gotta say that though. Japan is completely on its own.
That makes sense now.
Yeah, they do things completely crazy and it works, but it's because it's Japan. Yeah.
But with your experience in Singapore and China, so it's to you, it's really different from Japan. It's really
Japan, because I work with them as well, and you just like what? It's like, but it works. So I think it's only Japan. I don't know, for some reason. I think the production value is so high in Japan that even if they do crazy, the production value generally saves it. And also, I think if you know it's from Japan, you tend to kind of accept it as like it's cool. I don't know why, but Japan has a lot of weird IPs. That works. So, but it's great. But it's hard to do that anywhere else because they've been doing that for 20, 30 years, kind of revolutionized weird to be cool. But we can't take that risk. We can't go into China, let's make a film that's just completely random and see if it makes money. It's too hard. But what do you do in Japan? Concept artist for who?
For Capcom.
Oh, I think I met you before.
Yeah, I met you.
Oh, yeah. You're up in Osaka, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. You still there?
Yeah.
That's fun. But Stars means Street Fighter is pretty down to earth, though. Is that what you work on?
No.
Oh, you can't talk about it? Okay.
Can't talk about it.
Okay. But Street Fighter is a pretty grounded thing. They're actually a very stereotypical IP in terms of if you look at the designs. They do exactly what the character does. You see, like the Russian guy is a huge guy, the Jamaican guy is a dancer guy, right? Like they don't break the stereotype. They actually do it. Actually, something we tell our students, when you design, it's, I don't want to say, you're probably going to get bad on Twitter or something like that. It's almost that borderline between racism and stereotype. It's almost like that. Because you look at Street Fighter, it's freaking Ryu, like, is that racist or is that cultural? But it is that. You know what I'm saying? So like you look at the Jamaican guys bouncing around doing Jamaican dance, it's like, but no one's caused it. It is a little bit of that in design. Because you try to get away from it, you're resetting culture. And culture is a great thing to have. And if you started from there, nothing wrong with it. The samurai guy should be a guy with a big thing and, angry. The sumo guy should be a big dude that slaps you around. Start from there. And then branches out. So, yeah. But Japan, yeah, weird, very crazy out there. Yeah, we did some stuff for Square a while back. It was just, what the heck is going on? So we don't even know what's going on. We're like, okay, this is what they want. We'll design it. So, all right. I guess there's a waiting room or something like that. If there's more questions, is it? Oh, I supposed to remind you guys to fill in some kind of survey thing. I'm not sure how that works, but I think it's digital. You get an email, or you could do it here. So because GDC really appreciates if you guys have feedback regarding this. So I guess is there some kind of? Okay, I don't know. You guys, you could take me to it. So if you guys have more questions, want to say hi and do whatever, I'll be following him to some area. Yeah, I'll see you guys there. All right. See you.